My name's Emma Terwilliger. I'm from Ely, Minnesota. I'm a senior and I'm an anthropology major in education and creative writing minors. On the project this summer, I worked on a lot of research summaries of interviews, and then I did a lot of categorizing quotes within the interviews into specific themes that we've been working with throughout the study, and then I have written a few stories that will be put in the book before chapters, and I also worked on a project on sex education and sexual consent education at the school. Yeah, so for that research project, like I mentioned, I did an analysis of all of the interviews for how the participants talked about sexual assault and sexual consent education within their schools and sex ed within their schools. And then I basically wanted to look at whether or not sex education at the schools was adequate or inadequate, and I found that the majority were inadequate at the schools. And then I also categorized participants' experiences within different themes. So I looked at a lot of the participants talked about how schools integrated sex ed into the curriculum, or I analyzed within their interviews how the sex ed was sort of focused on upholding the schools position within society. So the schools had to talk about sex ed because of national events happening, like the Me Too movement and stuff like that. And then I also talked about how the sex education was often the participants talked about it as a means of sort of self-protection. So instead of doing the right thing because it was the right thing to do, or not engaging in sexual violence, they talked about the necessity of sex education as a means of self-protection because of how it could impact their futures rather than someone that they may have harmed. So I talked about that within the presentation. So I basically put together a poster and I did an oral presentation at the symposium on all of that. A lot of participants talked about sexualizing of teachers and how teachers were not treated well, specifically female teachers and younger female teachers at the schools. And so I think that was not necessarily surprising, but just something I hadn't thought about going in, of those dynamics especially regarding gender at the school, and how that impacts teachers also, and teachers' experiences at those schools. That I had a very, very different experience at a public school and a small public school, and that especially with the networks piece of it, that and just the privilege aspect of all boys schools for a lot of participants, just the differences in education and in how education is formatted and experienced by students was really interesting to learn about in contrast to my experience in a public school.